Dawn, late dry season. On the southern plains of Serengeti, the night's coolness retreats into the soil as the first light spreads across a horizon the color of ash and pale gold. Wind moves low through the brittle grass, carrying the dust of months without rain. In the half-light, shapes emerge, scattered acacia silhouettes, distant termite mounds, and the slow, uncertain movement of animals that survive the darkness. A wildebeest cow stands apart from the herd, flanks trembling, her breath visible in the chill. Around her, the plains hold a fragile stillness. Predators that hunted under cover at night now fade into shadow, but the danger has not passed. It has only changed hands. She lowers her head, muscles tightening as the first contractions ripple through her body. Birth here cannot wait for safety. It happens in the open, exposed to everything that watches. A calf spills onto the dust, motionless for a moment that stretches too long. Then a twitch, a breath, life, fragile and untested, arrives into a world already alert to its presence. Vultures circle high above, patient witnesses to every beginning and every end. Nearby, a jackal pauses, ears angled toward the sound, not drawn by cruelty, only by hunger. On these plains, birth is not a private event. It is a signal, a disturbance in the silence. And survival begins not with the first step, but with the first breath. Across the grassland ecosystems of East Africa, particularly within the Serengeti, Masai Mara system, birth is synchronized with the rhythm of rain and grass. The dominant herbivore of this landscape, the blue wildebeest, Connochetes tyrannus, is not merely a resident, but moving force that shapes the land itself. Nearly 1.3 million individuals participate in an annual migration that spans hundreds of kilometers, following seasonal growth of short, nutrient-rich grasses. This movement is not random wandering, but an evolutionary strategy refined over millennia, a response to fluctuating rainfall, predation pressure, and the metabolic demands of large grazing mammals. Calving occurs during a narrow window at the end of the wet season, typically within 2 to 3 weeks. Scientific field studies estimate that more than 8,000 calves can be born each day at the peak of this period. Such synchrony is a defensive adaptation. By overwhelming predators with sheer numbers, individual calves gain a statistical chance of survival. Lions, hyenas, and cheetahs cannot consume them all. The abundance dilutes risk. Yet for each newborn, survival remains uncertain. Mortality rates in the first months can exceed 50%, driven by predation, malnutrition, disease, and separation from the herd. Physiologically, wildebeest calves are born neurologically mature and physically developed, an example of a precocial species. Within minutes, they attempt to stand. Within an hour, many can run. This rapid mobility is essential in an environment where stationary life attracts attention. Unlike species that conceal their young in vegetation, wildebeest rely on movement and herd cohesion as defense. The calf must imprint on its mother's scent and vocalizations almost immediately. A failure in recognition can lead to fatal abandonment, as cows will not nurse unfamiliar offspring. The broader ecosystem responds to this surge of new life. Predators adjust territories to intercept migrating herds. Scavengers track the movement from above, mapping vulnerability across the plains. Even the grass benefits. Concentrated grazing stimulates new growth, recycling nutrients through dung and urine. The calving season becomes a pulse of energy that sustains countless other organisms, from insects to apex carnivores. Environmental pressures shape every stage of this process. Rainfall variability determines grass quality, which in turn influences milk production and maternal health. Drought years produce weaker calves and higher mortality, while abundant seasons allow greater survival, but can intensify disease transmission within dense herds. Research using satellite tracking and long-term population monitoring shows that the migration and calving patterns are tightly linked to climate oscillations, making the species both resilient and vulnerable to long-term environmental change. In this system, birth is not an isolated biological event. It is a coordinated emergence tied to landscape, weather, and the ancient memory of movement. Each calf represents both continuity and risk, a new life stepping into a cycle that is repeated for thousands of generations, yet never guarantees the same outcome twice. Predators of the East African plains have evolved in parallel with this abundance, forming one of the most studied predator-prey systems on Earth. The Serengeti supports the highest density of large carnivores remaining anywhere, a consequence of the vast migratory biomass that passes through it each year. For lions, Panthera leo, spotted hyenas, Crocuta crocuta, and cheetahs, Acinonyx jubatus, the calving season represents a temporary shift in strategy. Adult wildebeest are formidable and dangerous when cornered, capable of inflicting lethal injuries. Newborn calves, however, are vulnerable, inexperienced, and briefly separated during the chaos of birth. Predators concentrate their efforts on this window, not out of preference for weakness, but because energy economics demand efficiency. Hunting success rises, and with it, the survival prospect of predator cubs born months earlier in anticipation of the surplus. Behavioral studies using GPS collars and direct observation have revealed that lion prides often reposition themselves along migration corridors weeks before the herd arrive. Hyena clans expand patrol ranges, while cheetah mothers with cubs select open terrain, where visibility aids high-speed pursuits. Yet predation is not indiscriminate slaughter. It is constrained by fatigue, competition, and risk of injury. A lioness injured during a hunt may doom her entire pride. A cheetah that fails repeatedly risks starvation. The relationship between predator and prey is therefore a dynamic equilibrium, regulated by both abundance and limitation. Scavengers form another critical layer in this hierarchy. Vultures, including rupels and whiteback species, circle at altitudes exceeding 1,000 meters, using acute vision to detect disturbances below. Their presence is not merely opportunistic, but essential to ecosystem sanitation, rapidly consuming carcasses that might otherwise spread disease. Jackals and marabou storks exploit the margins, feeding on remains too small to interest larger carnivores. In this way, a single failed calf can sustain dozens of species, redistributing energy through the food web. The herbivores themselves influence vegetation patterns through selective grazing. Wildebeest prefer short grasses rich in nitrogen, leaving taller, coarser species for zebras and other grazers that precede them in the migration. This sequential feeding reduces competition and maintains plant diversity. Ecologists describe this as facilitation, one species modifying a habitat in ways that benefit another. Without the migratory herds, the plains would gradually shift toward less productive vegetation, altering fire regimes and water retention. Evolutionary pressures extend beyond predation. Disease, particularly rinderpest in the late 19th century, once devastated wildebeest populations, reducing them to a fraction of their former numbers. The subsequent eradication of the virus allowed a dramatic recovery, demonstrating how human intervention can reshape natural systems even at vast scales. Today, emerging threats include habitat fragmentation and climate change, which disrupt migration routes that have remained stable since the last ice age. Within this intricate network, birth becomes both a renewal and a test of resilience. Each calf must navigate a landscape defined by hunger, competition, and scarcity, yet also sustained by cooperation and timing. The African wilderness is neither cruel nor benevolent. It operates through feedback loops, life-generating opportunity, law-sustaining balance, a system in which survival is measured not by permanence, but by the ability to endure long enough to reproduce and move on. Survival on the African plains begins as a physiological challenge before it becomes a behavioral one. For a newborn wildebeest, the first minutes determine whether muscle, bone, and instinct will align quickly enough to avoid detection. Unlike species that rely on concealment, wildebeest calves are adapted for immediate locomotion. Their limb bones are proportionally long at birth, and neuromuscular coordination develops in utero, allowing them to stand within minutes. Field observations show that mothers actively stimulate this process, nudging and circling the calf, encouraging blood flow and alertness. Remaining on the ground is not rest. It is exposure. The scent of birth fluids travels far on dry season wind, carrying information predators whose survival depends on interpreting such signals. Defense, in this context, is collective rather than individual. Herd structure creates a shifting wall of bodies, horns, and hooves that confuses predators and shields the vulnerable. Adult wildebeest will sometimes charge approaching threats, not as deliberate guardianship, but as an instinctive response to movement within a tightly packed group. This behavior produces moments of apparent cooperation without requiring social bonds comparable to those of primates or elephants. The calves' task is simpler and more urgent: remain within the visual and olfactory radius of its mother. Separation often leads to fatal disorientation, as cows will reject calves that fail to match their specific vocal and scent cues. Predators exploit the edges of the system. Cheetahs target individuals that stray, relying on speed rather than strength, while hyenas test the cohesion of the herd through persistence. Lions, capable of overpowering adults, still prefer the lower risk presented by the young. Yet hunts frequently fail. Dust, heat, and terrain interfere. Prey zigzags unpredictably. Competitors intervene. Studies estimate that large carnivores succeed in only a fraction of attempts, underscoring that survival for herbivores is not purely luck, but the outcome of evolved endurance strategies. Nutrition shapes the next phase of vulnerability. The mother's milk, high in fat and protein, supports rapid growth, but depends entirely on her own access to quality forage. During drought years, reduced grass nutrition lowers milk yield, weakening calves and prolonging the period of susceptibility. Some perish not from direct predation, but from exhaustion, unable to keep pace as the herd resumes migration. Movement is relentless. The ecosystem offers no permanent refuge. Waterholes shrink, grass is yellow, and the horizon dictates the next step. In this environment, survival biology is a continuum rather than a single event. Birth initiates a race measured not in distance, but in adaptation. The capacity of a young animal to synchronize its fragile beginnings with the momentum of an entire migrating population. Instinct governs much of early life on the plains, yet it is not a rigid script. Young wildebeest display a rapid learning curve shaped by observation and repetition rather than conscious reasoning. Within days, calves begin to anticipate directional shift in the herd, responding to subtle cues: a ripple of movement, a change in vocal tone, the sudden alert posture of adults scanning the horizon. Cognitive research on ungulates suggests that such responsiveness arises from a combination of inherited neural pathways and early sensory imprinting. The calf does not understand danger. It recognizes patterns associated with it. When adults bunch together or pivot toward a distant disturbance, the young follow, guided by proximity and momentum rather than analysis. Maternal recognition remains one of the most critical behavioral mechanisms during this stage. Each cow produces a distinct vocal signature, a low-frequency call that carries across wind and distance. Calves memorize this sound alongside scent markers, forming a bond that persists even in confusion of thousands moving as one. Experiments involving temporary separation have shown that reunions rely heavily on acoustic cues, with mothers calling repeatedly until the calf responds. Failure to reconnect often results in starvation, as nursing is highly selective. Unlike species that form communal nurseries, wildebeest maintain strict maternal exclusivity, a strategy that conserves energy in an environment where resources fluctuate unpredictably. Social structure within the herd is fluid, lacking permanent leadership, yet exhibiting coordinated movement. This phenomenon, studied through aerial observation and satellite tracking, reflects decentralized decision-making. Small groups initiate directional changes that propagate outward, producing a collective shift without centralized control. For calves, this means survival depends on staying within the flow, rather than seeking guidance from a dominant individual. The herd itself becomes a navigational system, an emergent property of many animals, responding to shared environmental signals, such as distant thunderheads or the scent of fresh grass carried on seasonal winds. Rival species influence behavior as well. Plain zebras often precede wildebeest migrations, grazing taller grasses and exposing the shorter growth preferred by their followers. This interspecies sequencing reduces competition and improves feeding efficiency for both. However, it also concentrates animals into predictable routes, allowing predators to anticipate crossings at rivers and narrow corridors. For a calf, these bottlenecks represent moments of extreme peril, where exhaustion, steep banks, and concealed predators converge. Nature's neutrality is most evident in these interactions. No element of the system intends harm or mercy. Each organism responds to its own pressures of survival and reproduction. The calf's vulnerability is balanced by the mother's investment, the herd's momentum, and the landscape's capacity to sustain life only in motion. Intelligence here is not measured by problem solving, but by alignment with processes older than any individual. Instincts refined by generations that endured or disappeared depending on how closely they matched the demands of plains. By midday, the heat has hardened the earth, baking moisture from the surface until each step releases a faint puff of dust. The herd moves with growing urgency toward a ribbon of green visible in the distance, a seasonal river that still holds water despite the long, dry months. For the adults, it is relief. For the newborn calves, it is an ordeal waiting to unfold. The approach compresses thousands of bodies into a narrowing corridor bordered by thorn scrub and eroded banks. Sound builds gradually. Hooves drumming, low grunts, the sharp whistles of alarm spreading faster than sight. At the front, animals hesitate. The river is not wide, but its banks drop steeply into murky water where the bottom cannot be seen. Recent crossings have churned the edges into slick mud. Some adults descend carefully, sliding and scrambling, while others turn back, colliding with those behind them. In this congestion, calves are separated from mothers in seconds. Their smaller bodies vanish between legs, their calls lost beneath the rising noise. A few find footing and follow the scent of milk across the slope, but others falter, trapped in pockets of panic where movement has no direction. Below the surface, the water holds its own dangers. Now crocodiles, motionless until now, sense vibration through pressure changes along their jaws and bodies. They do not rush. They wait for density, for the moment when prey must commit to the crossing, because retreat is no longer possible. When the first crocodile lunges, the reaction above is instantaneous. The herd surges forward, transforming hesitation into a blind charge. Hooves strike water in a chaotic cascade, churning mud into opaque clouds that hide both predator and escape. Calves enter last, pushed by the momentum behind them. Their legs, built for speed on open ground, struggle against the drag of water and the pull of the current. Some attempt to swim, nostrils flaring, eyes wide above the surface. Others are swept sideways into deeper channels where footing disappears entirely. A mother turns back against the flow, calling, searching for the shape and scent she recognizes among hundreds nearly identical. Around her, bodies collide, climb, and scramble for the far bank where survival briefly resembles safety. This crossing is not a hunt in the conventional sense, nor a deliberate confrontation. It is an environmental trial, a place where geography, timing, and biological necessity converge. For many calves, it will mark the end of a life measured in hours or days. For others, it will become the first memory etched into muscle and instinct. That survival in the African wilderness often depends on enduring forces that cannot be seen until they are already in motion. On the far bank, the survivors emerge into a confusion of exhaustion and urgency. Adults scramble up the steep incline, hooves cutting into loose soil, dislodging stones that tumble back toward the water. Calves attempt to follow paths carved by those ahead, but the slope collapses under their lighter weight, forcing repeated efforts that drain already limited strength. Some are lifted unintentionally by the pressure of bodies behind them, carried upward by the sheer density of the herd. Others slip back, sliding toward the churned mud, where the boundary between land and water has become unstable. Predators wait beyond the crest, drawn not by anticipation of the crossing itself, but by the predictable weakness that follows. Lionesses lie flattened in the sparse shade of acacia trees, their tawny coats blending with the parched earth. They target not the strongest nor the slowest at random, but individuals isolated by injury, disorientation, or youth. A calf separated during the ascent becomes visible in the open terrain, its calls high and unmodulated, lacking the deeper resonance of adults. One lioness accelerates from concealment, closing the distance in seconds. The chase is brief. The calf's legs, still trembling from the crossing, cannot sustain speed on uneven ground. Elsewhere, hyenas arrive at a loping trot, guided by scent and sound. Their role is both predator and opportunist, capable of pursuing weakened animals or displacing other hunters through persistence. Competition erupts in fragments across the plain, each event unfolding independently, yet contributing to the same redistribution of energy. The herd, meanwhile, does not stop. Movement remains its only defense. Mothers call continuously, weaving through the mass in search of missing young. Some reunions occur abruptly, a calf answering the correct voice, pushing through flanks and horns until contact is reestablished. Others never happen, the bond severed by distance or confusion. As afternoon light lengthens, the pace slows. The immediate crisis has passed, replaced by the quieter toll of attrition. Bodies lie scattered along the riverbanks and in the grass beyond, marking where exhaustion or predation claimed them. Vultures descend in widening spirals, their shadows crossing the ground like slow-moving clouds. For the survivors, the landscape ahead offers no time for recovery. The migration continues toward distant storms that promise new grass, new water, and the possibility of sustaining those who endured the crossing. In the chronology of a wildebeest life, this moment stands as a threshold. Those that survive carry forward not memory in the human sense, but physiological adaptation. Muscles conditioned by stress, instinct sharpened by exposure, danger. The river does not remember them, nor do the predators. Yet the outcome reshapes the herd's composition, determining which individuals will reach maturity and contribute to the next cycle of birth on the plains. In the days following the crossing, the herd spreads across newly reached grazing grounds where recent storms have awakened a flush of green. The grass here is shorter, richer in nitrogen, and easy to digest, a critical resource for lactating mothers whose energy reserves were depleted by the ordeal. Calves that survive begin to recover weight rapidly, nursing frequently and resting in brief intervals between movements. Physiological stress markers observed in similar populations show elevated cortisol levels immediately after such events, gradually declining as food availability stabilizes. Recovery, however, is uneven. Some calves remain weakened, their growth delayed by dehydration and muscle fatigue sustained during the crossing. Maternal behavior shifts subtly in this period. Cows become more vigilant, maintaining closer proximity to their offspring and reacting quickly to disturbances. Observational studies indicate increased defensive posturing during the first week after major migrations or crossings, suggesting that mothers compensate for the calves' temporary vulnerability. Yet this heightened attention cannot be sustained indefinitely. As the herd resumes long-distance movement, the necessity of feeding competes with the need for protection. Grazing requires lowered heads and dispersed spacing, conditions that again expose the young to predators, testing the herd's cohesion. Predator dynamics adjust in response to the reduced abundance of weakened prey. Lions and hyenas expand their hunting range, following the herd's direction of travel, while cheetahs exploit the open terrain where visibility favors pursuit of smaller targets, such as gazelles. Carcasses left from the crossing continue to support scavenger communities for several days, delaying the need for immediate predation. This temporary surplus illustrates how episodic mortality events ripple through the ecosystem, sustaining species that rarely interact directly with the migration itself. Disease risk rises as well. Injuries sustained on rocky banks or from trampling create entry points for infection, and dense congregation around fresh grazing increases transmission of parasites. Veterinary research on wild ungulates has documented spikes in tick infestations and bacterial infections following high-stress movements, particularly in seasons when immune function is compromised by nutritional deficits. For calves, whose immune systems are still developing, such challenges can prove as lethal as predators. Despite these losses, the herd's overall momentum restores a semblance of stability. Movement becomes less frantic, more deliberate, guided by distant rainfall patterns detected through scent and atmospheric changes. The calves begin to integrate into the rhythm of travel, matching the pace that once threatened to leave them behind. Survival at this stage is no longer measured by minutes or hours, but by the capacity to endure the next phase of the journey. Weeks of walking across landscapes where abundance and scarcity alternate without warning. The aftermath of the crossing, thus, reveals a quieter dimension of survival, not the visible drama of pursuit or escape, but the slow recalibration of bodies and behaviors after extreme stress. It is here, in recovery rather than crisis, that the long-term fate of the newborn generation is determined. As weeks pass, the calves that endured the crossing begin to lose the fragile outline of infancy. Their limbs strengthen, coordination improves, and the awkward gait of the newborn gives way to a steadier, ground-covering stride. Growth is rapid but uneven, shaped by access to milk, quality of forage, and the absence or presence of lingering injury. By the time the herd reaches the outer edges of the Masai Mara, many calves have doubled their birth weight, an essential threshold for surviving the next migration cycle. Those that fail to recover fully fall behind during daily movements, gradually disappearing from the population without a single defining moment marking their loss. Social patterns shift as well. Young males begin tentative sparring, brief clashes of heads and shoulders that rehearse the dominance contest of adulthood. These interactions are not yet territorial disputes but developmental exercises, strengthening muscles and establishing neurological pathways associated with future competition. Females remain closer to maternal lines, forming loose associations that may persist into maturity. The herd structure, though fluid, carries subtle generational continuity shaped by which individuals survive the early hazards of life on the plains. Predation pressure stabilizes into a familiar equilibrium. Lions resume targeting adult prey when opportunities arise, while hyenas alternate between hunting and scavenging depending on conditions. For the now stronger calves, vulnerability declines but never disappears. Research indicates that juvenile mortality remains elevated to the first year, particularly during periods of drought when weakened adults cannot defend effectively. The memory of abundance created by the calving season fades, replaced by the ongoing negotiation between energy gained and energy spent. Ecologically, the migration's passage leaves a transformed landscape behind. Grazed grasslands regenerate with fresh shoots, enriched by nutrients deposited through waste and decomposition. Insect populations surge, followed by birds and small mammals that exploit the temporary fertility. What began as a crisis of survival for individuals becomes a process of renewal for the ecosystem as a whole. The deaths along the riverbank and the lives that continued forward are inseparable parts of this cycle, each sustaining the other in ways invisible at a distance. For the surviving calves, independence approaches gradually. Nursing intervals lengthen and reliance on maternal proximity decreases as confidence in movement grows. Yet separation remains perilous. The herd is both refuge and constraint, offering protection while demanding constant motion. By the time the rains begin again in the south, the young will have traveled hundreds of kilometers, a distance that transforms them from vulnerable newborns into participants in one of the planet's largest terrestrial migrations. In the African wilderness, survival is rarely a single triumph. It is accumulation of strength, experience, and timing, carried forward until the next season resets a balance between birth and loss. The plains stretch endlessly under a late afternoon sky, the light softening to gold before fading into violet. The calves that survive the crossing move alongside adults, no longer fragile, yet still tested by every gust of wind, every shifting shadow, every call that signals unseen eyes. Life here is neither kind nor cruel. It is indifferent, governed by the imperatives of energy, reproduction, and the unceasing cycles of rainfall and grass. Each birth, each death, contributes to the balance, a rhythm older than human observation. In this landscape, endurance is a measure of success. Strength, instinct, and timing dictate which lives continue and which do not. Yet none of it is moral or malicious. Survival is neither celebrated nor mourned by the ecosystem. It simply unfolds, an intricate choreography of bodies, energy, and environment. The calves that now run across the plains are both continuation and adaptation, living proof of the relentless but precise logic of life in the wild. As dusk descends, the wind carries dust and the faint scent of wet earth from distant rains. The herd slows, resting momentarily, but the vigilance never ceases. The African wilderness offers no guarantees. It offers only opportunity and risk in equal measure. Within this balance lies a quiet lesson. Life persists not through intention, but through alignment with forces far larger than any single creature. In the end, survival is measured not by triumph over others, but by the ability to endure long enough to breathe, move, and continue to cycle, a testament to resilience etched into muscle, bone, and instinct across generations that will face the same plains tomorrow and the day after that.